Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we reveal the chilling story of a nurse's fight for justice after a horrific assault. Sarah had always been dedicated to her work as a nurse. She loved caring for others, and the hospital had become like a second home to her over the years. Located in the heart of the city, it was known for its exceptional medical care and state-of-the-art equipment. Sarah worked the night shifts, which gave her a sense of calm. The hospital was quieter during these hours, and though there were fewer staff on duty, she appreciated the peacefulness it offered. It was a welcome break from the constant chaos of the day shift. That night, like so many others, Sarah prepared for her shift with a sense of routine. She arrived at the hospital a little early, changed into her scrubs, and grabbed a coffee from the break room. The low hum of the hospital at night always seemed to give her a moment to clear her mind before the work began. The lights flickered softly above her as she made her way down the sterile hallways, ready to take on whatever came her way. She went about her rounds, checking on patients and ensuring that all the necessary supplies were stocked. The night passed slowly, but it wasn't unusual. The emergency room was quiet, and the patients in the ICU were stable. Sarah's shift had become monotonous, and while she found comfort in the routine, she also felt isolated. There were fewer people to talk to, and the long, empty hallways gave her an eerie feeling. It was the perfect environment for someone to go unnoticed, to hide in plain sight. As Sarah was walking down the hallway to grab some more medical supplies, she passed a storage room. Inside, she saw Mark, a senior technician, along with two other men she recognized but didn't know well: David, a janitor, and Ethan, a security guard. They all worked in different departments, but Sarah had seen them around the hospital before. Mark was the most familiar. He had a reputation for being overly friendly, sometimes making flirtatious comments toward the women on staff. Sarah had always brushed it off as harmless. He wasn't the first man in the hospital to make such remarks, and she hadn't given it much thought. She continued down the hallway, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But just moments later, as she entered the storage room to retrieve some medical supplies, the atmosphere shifted. The door clicked shut behind her with an almost imperceptible sound. Before Sarah could react, the three men stepped toward her, their smiles turning cold and predatory. Something in their demeanor made her heart race, but she couldn't place it. The usual warmth she had experienced from Mark vanished, replaced with an uncomfortable tension in the air. Unaware of what was to come, Sarah continued about her duties, trying to stay calm. But within moments, the situation began to spiral. As Sarah entered the storage room, she noticed the men weren't just talking casually anymore. Their eyes locked onto her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Mark was the first to approach her, a grin spreading across his face. At first, Sarah thought it was a harmless joke, as it had been before, but the way the men moved closer to her made her uneasy. The door had been shut behind her, and she suddenly felt trapped, with no way to escape. Mark's words came out too quickly, almost too smooth, and he spoke in a voice that no longer seemed friendly. His compliments about her appearance made Sarah feel uncomfortable, as though he was crossing a line he had never crossed before. She took a step back, trying to keep her distance. But David and Ethan, standing closer to the door, blocked her path. She could feel the tension building in the room, an almost suffocating pressure that made it hard for her to think clearly. She tried to stay calm, reasoning with herself that it was just a misunderstanding. After all, Mark had never acted this way before. But the look in his eyes told a different story. It wasn't just playful teasing now, it was something darker. Sarah could feel her heart begin to race. She had to get out of there. She turned to move past the men, but David grabbed her arm firmly, holding her in place. Panic started to creep in. Sarah attempted to pull away, but his grip was too strong. Ethan, standing by the door, moved in closer as well, blocking off her only potential exit. In that moment, Sarah realized she was completely at their mercy. Her mind was spinning, her body tense, as she struggled to comprehend what was happening. The men's behavior shifted from flirtation to something far more aggressive. They began to close in on her, and she could feel the weight of their presence surrounding her. Mark reached out to touch her, and though she tried to push him away, his hands were relentless. Her body was frozen with fear. The realization hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. She wasn't just dealing with inappropriate comments anymore. She was trapped in a dangerous situation. She tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come out. The room, once full of sterile shelves and boxes, suddenly felt like a prison. Mark, David, and Ethan overpowered her with a force she wasn't prepared for. Their actions were swift, and Sarah was powerless to stop them. The humiliation and fear flooded her as they violated her. Every instinct told her to fight back, but in that moment, Sarah felt a crushing sense of helplessness. The quiet hospital, with its sterile walls and faint beeping machines, suddenly seemed like a maze she couldn't escape from. What was supposed to be a routine night shift had turned into a nightmare she would never forget. Sarah walked through the rest of her shift in a fog, her mind still reeling from what had just happened in the storage room. She couldn't comprehend the reality of the assault. The hospital, once a place where she felt in control and capable, now felt foreign to her. Every step she took seemed mechanical, as if her body was on autopilot. She tried to focus on her duties, checking on patients and administering care, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment in the room. The men's faces, their hands on her, their laughter still echoed in her mind. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every minute felt like an hour. She moved through the corridors, trying to keep her composure. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that she was being watched. She could feel their eyes on her, even though she hadn't seen them since the incident. Mark, David, and Ethan continued to act as though nothing had happened. They went about their jobs with ease, as if the assault was a distant memory. Their nonchalance only deepened Sarah's sense of isolation. How could they behave this way? Didn't they realize what they had done to her? Her coworkers noticed something was off. Sarah's usually bright demeanor had been replaced with a cold distance. Her movements were slower, her gaze distant. But Sarah said nothing. She couldn't find the words. How could she explain what had happened in that storage room? How could she even begin to process the horror of it all? She couldn't bring herself to speak up. Fear gnawed at her, the thought of retaliation, of being labeled as a troublemaker, or even worse, not being believed. The hospital was a tight-knit community, and Sarah feared the judgment of her peers. The assault lingered in her every waking moment. The men's faces haunted her thoughts, and every corner of the hospital felt like a reminder of her vulnerability. She tried to avoid them, keeping her distance whenever she saw them in the halls. But the fear of running into them, of being trapped again, weighed heavily on her. Her confidence, once so strong, had shattered. Each shift felt like a battle, but Sarah went through the motions, convincing herself that she had to keep going, that she couldn't let the incident define her. By the end of her shift, Sarah was exhausted physically, mentally, and emotionally. She just wanted to go home and forget, but she knew that wasn't possible. The trauma had embedded itself deep within her, and no matter how much she tried to suppress it, the memory of that night would follow her. It had only just begun to sink in that she couldn't escape what had happened. She had been assaulted by 3 men in a place she had trusted. The realization hit her harder than anything before. Sarah's internal struggle became unbearable as the days passed. She could no longer ignore the weight of what had happened. Her mind was consumed by guilt and fear, yet she knew she couldn't carry this burden alone forever. The trauma had affected her every aspect of life, from her interactions with coworkers to her inability to sleep or concentrate. It was as though the world around her had become a blur, and all she could see were the faces of the men who had assaulted her. Finally, after weeks of silent suffering, Sarah reached out to her closest friend, Claire, who worked in the hospital's human resources department. Claire had noticed the change in Sarah, her withdrawn demeanor, her disheveled appearance, but had never pressed her about it. She respected Sarah's privacy, but it was clear something was wrong. When Sarah finally confided in her, it was as though a dam had broken. The words poured out of her, recounting every detail of the assault. Claire listened carefully, her face filled with shock and disbelief. She had never imagined that something like this could happen in their workplace, a place meant to care for others. Once Sarah had finished, Claire didn't hesitate. She immediately offered to help and assured Sarah that she would support her no matter what. Sarah had been terrified of speaking up, afraid of the consequences, but hearing her friend's calm reassurance made her realize that she couldn't remain silent any longer. It was time to take action, not just for herself, but for the other women who might be facing the same danger. The following day, Claire took Sarah's statement to the hospital's HR department, where an investigation was quickly launched. Sarah's confession set off a chain of events that she had never imagined. Her story was now being heard, and the hospital had no choice but to act. As HR dug deeper into the men's backgrounds, they discovered that this was not the first time such incidents had occurred. David and Ethan had been involved in similar allegations in the past, but the complaints had either been ignored or swept under the rug. Mark's history wasn't spotless either, with reports of inappropriate behavior toward female staff members that had never led to any disciplinary action. The revelation shocked the hospital administration. What had initially seemed like an isolated incident was now part of a pattern of misconduct that had been allowed to continue for years. Sarah's courage in coming forward had opened the floodgates, and the investigation grew broader. Evidence was gathered, interviews were conducted, and it became clear that the men had been exploiting their positions of power for far too long. What Sarah had feared most, the possibility of no one believing her, was no longer a concern. She wasn't alone anymore. Her voice had become the spark that would ignite the change. The trial that followed the investigation was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. The hospital had made a public statement, admitting its failure to act sooner and pledging to make changes. The media quickly picked up the story, and Sarah found herself thrust into the public eye. While part of her was grateful for the attention it meant the truth was finally being heard, she also felt exposed and vulnerable. She was no longer just a nurse, she was a symbol of courage for those who had suffered in silence. The weight of that responsibility weighed heavily on her, but it also gave her strength. The men who had assaulted her were arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault. Mark, David, and Ethan faced a long and difficult legal battle, but Sarah knew the fight was far from over. The courtroom became a place of intense scrutiny, with the defense attempting to discredit Sarah's testimony. The men tried to paint her as unreliable, casting doubt on her character and questioning her motives. But Sarah stood firm. She relived the pain of that night, her voice shaking but unwavering as she told the court exactly what had happened. She was determined to see justice served, no matter how difficult the process was. Throughout the trial, Sarah was supported by her family and friends. Claire, who had been there from the start, stood by her side in the courtroom, offering quiet encouragement when the pressure felt too much. The emotional toll on Sarah was immense. Every day in court was a reminder of the trauma she had endured, but she refused to let the men win. She wanted her voice to be heard not just for herself, but for all the other women who had been hurt and silenced before her. The jury deliberated for days, but eventually the verdict was delivered. Mark, David, and Ethan were found guilty on all charges. The news brought a sense of relief, but it was tempered by the recognition that no verdict could ever undo the damage they had caused. The men were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, and the hospital promised to overhaul its policies to prevent future incidents. While Sarah felt a sense of justice, she knew the real work was just beginning. For Sarah, the healing process was long and difficult. Despite the verdict, the emotional scars remained. She eventually left the hospital, unable to return to the place where her life had been shattered. She sought therapy, working through her trauma and learning how to rebuild her sense of safety and trust. Though the legal battle was over, Sarah knew her journey to recovery would take time. But through it all, she found strength in the support of those around her, and in the knowledge that her actions had made a difference. The hospital changed, and Sarah's courage became a catalyst for a broader conversation about workplace safety and accountability. It was a bittersweet victory, but one that gave her hope for a better future.